This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Today I'll show you how to knit a cozy textured cowl. This is a great beginner project for those who are new to knitting in the round. Knit in seed stitch, this cowl uses knits and purls to create a really nubby texture that's visually interesting and really nice to touch. This cowl looks great on women and men. Just look at my friends Ross and Breck modeling this cowl in a forest green color, so blue steel. I'm using a super bulky yarn for this cowl, which means it knits up so quickly, but I'll share how you can knit with other yarn weights so that you can use whatever yarn you have. To knit this cowl successfully, you should be familiar with the cast on, the knit stitch, and the cast off. I'll go through other techniques in the video like how to knit with circular needles, how to substitute other yarns, how to purl, and my tip for knitting seed stitch the easy way. All right, let's get into materials. For the cowl that I'm knitting, I use 2 balls of Valley Yarns Superwash Super Bulky yarn in the color Dusty Rose. I'm also using a 10mm 16-inch circular needle, a tapestry needle, a tape measure, scissors, and a stitch marker. The knitting gauge for my cowl is 9 stitches and 17 rounds in seed stitch equals 4 inches or 10 centimeters. The cowl worn by Ross and Breck is knit with 1 ball of Debbie Bliss Super Chunky Merino in the color Leaf. I also used a 9mm circular needle and cast on 55 stitches. How much yarn do you need? So here is a quick and dirty yarn estimate on the amount of yarn you'll need based on the yarn weight. So keep in mind that the thinner the yarn, the taller the cowl can be, basically to account for more scrunching and folds in thinner fabric. So while I'm knitting my cowl to be 7.5 inches in height for super bulky yarn, you may knit your cowl to be 10 inches or even more if you're knitting with sock weight or sport weight yarn. Let's say I want to knit this cowl with this worsted weight yarn. So this yarn is significantly thinner than the super bulky weight yarn that I'm actually going to be knitting it with. So you can just see like a really quick comparison how much thinner the yarn is, right? So it's totally fine if you want to knit with a worsted weight yarn or even a fingering sock weight yarn, not a problem. But the big question is, how many stitches are you going to cast on? This yarn is so much thinner than the super bulky weight. You will obviously need more stitches. So I'm going to show you a really easy way to figure out how many stitches to cast on. So what you're going to need to do is knit up a little swatch in seed stitch. So I've done that right here, and you basically need to figure out how many stitches equals 4 inches in seed stitch with your yarn of choice. You will need to cast on a number of stitches that's going to be at least 4 inches wide or wider, and make sure that you cast on an odd number of stitches. And then you're going to do a 1-row repeat, which is knit 1, purl 1, and keep going, okay? Continue to knit, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1 to the last stitch, at which point you are going to knit 1. And you're going to repeat that again, okay? And then you will get seed stitch, knit flat. So once you have seed stitch knit flat and you've got a little swatch like this, then you're going to grab your tape measure. So we need to figure out how many stitches equals 4 inches. So I'm going to bring my tape measure here and just measure from this stitch all the way to here. That should be 4 inches, right? So I'm going to count how many stitches that is. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, and 23. So I'm going to write that down. So we want the circumference of our cowl to be 22 inches. So I'm going to go blank stitches equals 22 inches. So basically we know that 23 stitches equals 4 inches, and we want to figure out how many stitches will give us 22 inches. 22 inches is the circumference, so I'll just draw the cowl right here. This measurement here, this is what we would call the circumference, the width, I guess, of the entire cowl. We want that to be 22 inches. All right, so now we're going to do some very basic math with the help of a calculator. And we're going to go 22 into 4 equals 5.5. All right, so in order to get to 22, we need to multiply 4 by 5.5. So I'll just put in brackets times 5.5. So that means we need to do the same thing to 23. So I'm going to go 23 times 5.5 equals 126.5. Okay, so that is the number of stitches that we need to cast on if we want to knit with this worsted weight yarn. Okay, so if this is super confusing to you, don't worry, all right? All you need to know is figure this out. For your yarn, it may be like, I don't know, 20, okay? Once you've figured that, multiply this number, in our case 20, by 5.5. So with our mystery yarn here, it would be 20 stitches times 5.5, and then you've got 110 stitches. So then you'll know that you need to cast on 110 stitches in order to get 22. However, in order to knit seed stitch in the round following this pattern, you need an odd number of stitches. 126.5 is not possible number of stitches to cast on. So I can either round up or I can round down. So I can end up casting on 127, or I can round down and go 125 stitches. Totally up to you, okay? And with our hypothetical yarn here, I need an odd number of stitches. 110 is even. So I would go either round up to 111 stitches, or I would round down to 109 stitches, okay? So either of these options would be fine. We just need an odd number. If you are knitting with your own yarn, figure out how many stitches equals 4 inches with your swatch in seed stitch, and then do a little bit of math. And that will give you the number of stitches you need to cast on. Make sure that number is an odd number, and then you're ready to go. Wow, okay, I know that was a lot. So before we start casting on, I just want to go over some points about knitting with circular needles. So you'll notice that a circular needle has 2 needles and they're connected by a flexible cable. So when you are knitting with circular needles, you would hold both needles in your hand like this. And it's very similar to knitting flat in that one needle is in your right hand, one needle is in your left hand. And assuming that you're right-handed, you'll be using your right hand needle to kind of go into the stitch and pick it out. When you're knitting with the circular needle, you're not turning your work over, right? So when we're knitting with flat needles, you would knit the row and then turn it over back into your other hand, right? You are just kind of turning over the work as you finish each row. When you are knitting with circular needles, you never turn over your work. Your knitting is always just on one side. So you're kind of knitting like in a spiral. You're going around and around in your work, and that's how your work grows. You never turn your work over. If this is your first time knitting with circular needles, then you may find this video helpful where I go through how to knit with circular needles. In the round, I go into a lot more detail. This video, I'm just going to touch on the really important points. But if you want more detail, check out that video. I've got my yarn here, and we're going to cast on 49 stitches for my super bulky weight yarn. If you are using another yarn weight, cast on the number that you figured out doing the calculations. Just make sure you're casting on an odd number of stitches. All right, so I'm going to use the long tail cast on. So I'm just going to estimate like a length of yarn that will give me 49 stitches. So I'm going to put my little loop onto my circular needle and just tighten it up. If you need instructions on how to cast on with the long tail cast on, I will link that as well. But we're just going to speed through this. And I'm pushing the stitches down the needle as I create them. So now I've cast on 49 stitches onto my needle, and you can see that the stitches just fill up the whole cable and they kind of get all the way to the other side of the needle. Okay, so now our stitches are not connected, right? And what we want is for our stitches, our first and last cast on stitches, to be connected in a circle so that when we knit, our knitting is just one continuous circle. So this is what I meant when I say that. When we join in the round, our knitting is actually going to be going in a spiral. It's all joined together. So because we're knitting in one circular loop, we need a way to mark the beginning and end of the round. And we do that with a stitch marker. If you don't have a stitch marker, you can actually make one or you can buy one. This is typically what a stitch marker looks like, a commercially available one. However, this one is too small for my needle. This is a really big needle. It's a 10mm needle. So I need a much bigger stitch marker than what I actually have. So a really easy way for you to make a stitch marker is literally using some yarn or string. Cut off a length of yarn, fold the yarn in half, and I'm going to just tie a knot. I'm making the loop big enough that it can fit my needle. And now I'm going to just tighten up that knot, snip off this excess yarn, and now this would work as a stitch marker. I'm just going to push these stitches here onto my left needle. So I'm just going to push them up, and you'll find that the stitches are really stretchy. Our stitches are right on the tips of the needle, which is exactly what we want. Now, before we join in the round, we have to make sure our stitches are not twisted. If you take a look at our stitches, you'll see that part of the stitch is just like a loop, right? It just loops around our needle. And then this part here is kind of like a braided edge. Right now, the braided edge is facing inwards, okay? If your stitches look like this, I'm going to intentionally put in a twist like this, as in you've got a braided edge going in, and then at this point it twists out and then comes back in again. That's no bueno. What we want is to untwist it. So you would literally just untwist it, untwist your stitches so that all of the stitches are facing the same way, okay? Meaning that the braided edge here, it's all facing inwards. There's no twist, okay? Sometimes you may have multiple twists in your stitches. If you notice that in your knitting, just literally twist it back so that all of the stitches are facing the same direction. Okay, so when that is what your stitches look like, this is when you'll take out your stitch marker, whether a commercial one or one that you made like me, and you're going to pop it onto the right needle. And this is going to mark the beginning and end of our round. So now we're going to literally join the stitches in the round with my working yarn. That's the yarn that's attached to the ball of yarn. I'm going to take my right needle and insert it into the first stitch on my left needle. I'm just going to push my needle in. Let's push that out of the way. Push my needle in. With my working yarn, I'm going to wrap it around my right needle and just pull out a stitch. So we're just doing a knit stitch and then drop it off. At this point, I'm going to just tug on my yarn, and now you'll see that the stitches are joined perfectly in the round. Just by knitting into that first stitch on our left needle, our stitches have been joined. All right, so we are knitting in the round now. Now let's work round 1 of the seed stitch pattern. Now the seed stitch pattern has a 2-round repeat. So a round is basically knitting all of the stitches around your needle until you get to the beginning of the round. That is called a round. When you are knitting flat, we call it a row. So let's work the first round together. We start by doing a knit 1, which we just did to join the knitting, and then we're going to do a purl 1. Now purling is really similar to knitting, but instead of having the yarn in the back, we bring the yarn up front, okay? So again, normally our yarn is in the back when we're knitting. When we're purling, we bring the yarn up to the front, okay? And now, instead of knitting into the next stitch like this, from the bottom to the top, as we do when we're knitting, instead we're gonna go the opposite way. We're gonna go from the top to the bottom. So from the top of the next stitch down to the bottom, we'll just push our needle in, and then with the yarn up front, we're going to go counterclockwise, from the back of the needle to the front. And then we're going to pick this loop out through this stitch on our left needle. So I'm just going to kind of slowly guide the needle through, pick it out on the other side, and then drop it off. Okay, and that is a purl stitch. Then I would just give the yarn a little tug and then bring it to the back of the needle. And a purl stitch looks like this. It literally looks like a little bump. So you'll notice a knit just looks like a little V shape here, like it's flat. Whereas a purl has a little purl bump. Okay, so we'll do that again. Now, the stitch pattern is really simple. It consists of a knit 1, purl 1, all the way across the round to the last stitch, at which point we'll just do a knit 1. So this is a great opportunity to practice the purl stitch. So next we're going to do a knit 1, which you should know how to do. We're going to go into the next stitch, and with our yarn, just knit a stitch. Just pull out a knit stitch. Great. Now we're going to do a purl 1. So I'm going to bring the yarn, which is in the back, I'm going to bring it up front, just like this. And instead of going into the stitch from the bottom to the top, as we do when we're knitting, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to go into the next stitch on our left needle from the top to the bottom. We're just pushing in like that. And then with our yarn, which is now up front, we're going to go counterclockwise. We're going to go from the back to the front. And you can just kind of hold it like this if you'd like for more stability. And then we're going to just push this needle through, grab the loop we just made from within the stitch, and then drop it off of the left needle. And that is our purl stitch. I'll give it a little tug, bring the yarn to the back, and let's take a look at our work. That is our purl stitch. It's got a little purl bump right here. Okay, so I just want you to take a look at the 4 stitches we've just done and try to recognize which is a purl stitch, which is a knit stitch. A knit stitch has this little V shape. Okay, you can notice this here as well, this little V shape, whereas a purl has a little bump. Okay, a little purl bump. So just from looking at it, I can see this is a knit, this is a purl, this is a knit, this is a purl. And we're going to just keep going across the rest of the stitches, doing a knit 1, purl 1. So we've just done a purl, so the next stitch I'm going to knit into. So I'm going to bring my yarn, or bring my needle into the stitch, and just knit into that stitch, regular old knit stitch. There we go. And now we're going to do a purl. So I'm going to bring my yarn up front, and we're going to go into this next stitch from the top to the bottom, just like this, push my needle through. With my yarn up front, I'm going to wrap it counterclockwise. So again, yarn up front, going to go counterclockwise around my right needle, and then just pull that loop that I've made through and then off the needle, give it a little tug, bring the yarn to the back. Okay, and then my next stitch is going to be a knit stitch. Now, if you need a little bit more instruction, a little bit more detail on the purl stitch, I will link my purl stitch video up top and in the description so that you can have more slow motion, more repeats. So we've just done a knit stitch, and I can tell by this little flat V shape, right? So now I need to work a purl stitch. So I'll bring my yarn up front, and then I'm going to use my right needle to go into this next stitch from the top to the bottom, right? So not like this, but we're going to go in like this, top to the bottom, push the needle in. With my yarn up front, I'm going to go around the needle counterclockwise from the back to the front, and then I'm going to pick out that loop that is on my right needle. I'm going to pick it through the stitch. There we go. And then off the needle and bring the yarn to the back. Okay, and that is my purl stitch. So we've done a few knit 1, purl 1s, and I just want you to look at your work and again try to pick out which is a purl, which is a knit. Okay, and you should see them alternating: knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, and purl. Okay, so continue in this manner across the rest of the stitches, doing a knit and bringing the yarn up front, doing a purl. There we go. Bring the yarn to the back and do a knit. Bring the yarn up front and doing a purl. Now, it's important to remember after you purl that you should bring the yarn to the back, because your next stitch is going to be a knit stitch. And when you do a knit stitch, you always have the yarn in the back. So we'll do a knit stitch, bring the yarn up front, and do a purl stitch. Now your first round may be a little bit tight, so just push your stitches down onto the cable needle and push the next stitches on your left needle up onto the needle so that they're close to the tip, and that'll make it easier for you to knit your stitches. Now I'm nearing the end of my first round, and this is my last stitch here, right? So I want to point your attention to the tail end of the yarn. This is from your cast on. So if your tail end is sort of like over your stitches like this, I want you to bring it to the front and make sure it stays in the front, okay? Because at this point, this last stitch has a possibility of unraveling and falling apart if it is in the back like this. Make sure it's in the front, okay? Just hold on to that. Okay, so let's do the last 2 stitches. Here's my purl 1, there we go. And my last stitch, I'm making sure this strand of yarn is in the front. I'm literally holding it down, and I'm going to knit that last stitch. Beautiful. All right, so that is our first round complete. At this point, I'm going to move the stitch marker over from the left needle over to my right needle, bring it over, and that marks the end of our first round. Hurrah! I have a lot of anxious energy in my head and in my body, and I'm always looking for ways to quiet the thoughts or just channel them in a way that's more productive. So I've been loving this art journaling for self-care class by Amanda Rach Lee on Skillshare. I found the class to be really fun and relaxing. I love how Amanda talks about giving yourself the space to just create and doodle without putting pressure on yourself to make it really big or perfect. I've never really journaled my thoughts through art. I'm usually writing stuff down, but something about art is just so expressive and kind of abstract. I feel like I can be a lot more free in how I express myself. So I've loved this process. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes led by industry experts in design, illustration, DIY, and more. Skillshare can help you take your skills, passions, hobbies, and side hustles to the next level. As I've gotten older, I've found that creativity is key to my well-being. Whether I'm knitting, journaling, or just making something with my hands, creativity gives me energy. It makes me feel alive. So I've loved this opportunity to practice my creativity with Skillshare. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So get started today. So now let's move on to round 2. Round 2 is really similar, but we're going to start with a purl stitch. So I'm going to take my yarn and bring it up to the front, and with my right needle, I'm going to insert it into my left needle to purl. So I'm going to go in from the top to the bottom. Okay, I'm not going in to knit like this. We're going in from the top to the bottom, and with my yarn up front, I'm going to wrap it around my right needle, counterclockwise like this, and then just pull this loop that's around my right needle through the stitch on my left needle, just like that, and then drop it off of the needle. And I'm going to bring my yarn to the back and give it a nice little pull. And at this point, I'm also going to give a pull to this strand of yarn from my cast on. I just want to tighten up that area where our stitches join. Okay? Great, so that is our first stitch of round 2, which is a purl stitch. Next, I'm going to do a knit stitch. Okay, so I'm going to knit into this purl stitch. Here we go, I'm knitting into it. Great. And that is the repeat of our round 2. We're going to purl 1, knit 1, all the way around our second round till we get to the last stitch, at which point we will purl it. So let's just work that together. I've done purl 1 and then a knit 1, and now I'm going to do a purl 1 all over again. I'm going to bring the yarn up front, and then I'm going to go into this next stitch from the top to the bottom, wrap my yarn around counterclockwise, and then bring that loop through the stitch and off the needle, bring the yarn to the back, give it a little tug. Okay, that's my purl stitch. And then I'm going to do a knit stitch, okay? Just a regular knit stitch. And then we're back to the purl stitch. Yarn up front, into the next stitch from the top to the bottom. The yarn goes counterclockwise, and then we just pull the loop through the stitch and then off the needle, okay? And then the yarn to the back, give it a little tug. So let's take a look at our round 2. We started with a purl, this little bump. So that's our knit stitch, and then next is our purl, and then next is our little V, our knit, and then a purl. So next we're going to do a knit stitch. Knit 1, and then a purl 1. Bring the yarn up front, into the stitch from the top to the bottom, counterclockwise, pull the stitch through, and then off the needle. Now I'm going to share with you a tip, a hack, a really easy way to knit seed stitch that doesn't involve you needing to follow this pattern religiously. As in, you don't need to look at your pattern and go, okay, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, or purl 1, knit 1. All you really need to do with seed stitch is do the opposite of what the stitch is. Okay, so once you've established your first round, this rule applies. So if you look at your next stitches on your left needle, you'll see that our next stitch is a purl stitch, and I can tell by this little bump, right? And the stitch after that is a knit stitch. And you can tell by the little V shape, right? The one after it is a purl stitch. The one after that is a knit stitch, and a purl, and a knit, and a purl, and a knit. So when you see a purl stitch, instead of purling into it, you're going to knit into it. So you're doing the opposite of what the stitch is. The stitch is a purl, so we're going to knit into it. Okay, so here we go. I'm just going to knit into that purl stitch. And the stitch here is a knit stitch, right? You can tell by the little V, the flat V. So instead of knitting into it, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to purl. So I'm going to bring my yarn up front and purl into the knit stitch, and then bring the yarn in the back. The stitch here is a purl stitch. We can tell by the bump. So I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to knit into it. The stitch here is a knit stitch. We can tell by this little flat V. So I'm not knitting into it. I'm going to bring my yarn up front so that I can purl into it. Okay, this next stitch here is a purl stitch. I can tell by the bump. So I'm not purling into it. I'm going to knit into it. And the next stitch here is, say it with me, a knit stitch. You can tell by the V shape, the flat V. So I'm not going to knit into it. No, no, no. I'm going to purl into it. I'm going to bring the yarn up front and purl into that guy. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say you're doing the opposite of what the stitch is, okay? With seed stitch, we have two options. We're either knitting or purling. This is a purl stitch. We are not purling. We are going to, say it with me, knit. Okay, knit into it. So this is one way for you to knit seed stitch really easily without even really following the pattern, the round 1, round 2 pattern. If you feel more comfortable following the pattern, you could absolutely do that, but this is my little hack. Once you've established your first round, all you need to do for all subsequent rounds is to do the opposite of what the stitch is. So now we're nearing the end of round 2. So if we're following the pattern, our round 2 would say purl 1, knit 1 to the last stitch, and here is my last stitch, and we're going to purl 1. So I'll bring our yarn up front and do a purl 1. But if you weren't following the pattern, you could see that this is a knit stitch. Therefore, you're going to bring your yarn up front to purl it. Okay, so both options work. Great. So I'm going to give my yarn a little tug here, just a little habit of mine. Okay, so I'm going to bring my stitch marker from the left needle back over to the right needle. And now we're going to work it all over again. We're going to go right back to round 1, which is a knit 1, purl 1 to the last stitch, and then we're going to knit 1. And after that, you would work round 2 and do the same thing. Purl 1, knit 1 to the last stitch, purl 1. Or you can do my little hack, which is doing the opposite of what the stitch is. And that is literally the whole pattern. Okay, here's a purl stitch, and instead of purling it, you would knit it. Okay, here's a knit stitch. Instead of knitting it, you would, you guessed it, bring the yarn up front and purl it. Okay, and you could just repeat this. Okay, just follow this one principle, doing the opposite of what the stitch is for the entire cowl. That is the guiding principle. Do the opposite of what the stitch is until your whole piece measures 7.5 inches. So go ahead and just either work rounds 1 and round 2 until you reach 7.5 inches, or you can do the little hack, doing the opposite of what the stitch is. So happy knitting! So I've knit up a lot of seed stitch, and now we're going to measure how much we have. And ooh, I'm exactly at 7.5, so that means I can cast off now. So we're going to do what's called casting off in pattern. And all that means is that instead of knitting all of our stitches when we cast off, we're going to knit the stitches as if we were knitting seed stitch. So here we go. I'm just going to knit 2 stitches in seed stitch. I've just done the first one here, which was a knit, and my next one is going to be a purl stitch. I'll purl this. And now I've got 2 stitches. So I'm going to do just a regular cast off. I'm going to bring this first stitch over the second stitch. So I'm going to use my needle in my left hand and go into this stitch. And then I'm just going to drag it over the second stitch. There we go. Now we have just cast off one stitch. All right, so I'm going to go knit the next stitch. So this is a purl stitch, so I'm going to do the opposite of it. I'm going to knit into it. Okay, here we go, knit. And now I've got 2 stitches on my right needle. And I'll bring my left needle and go underneath that first stitch, and then just drag it over the second stitch, thereby casting it off. Okay, and we're going to keep going. This next stitch is a knit stitch, so I'm going to do the opposite, which is a purl. So I'll bring my yarn up front and just purl into it. And now we've got 2 stitches on the right needle, and I'm going to bring this first stitch over the second stitch. Now I was using my needle to kind of pull it over, but if you find that kind of difficult, you can actually just use your finger. So I can just grab this second stitch with my finger and drag it over that stitch. All right, and that is perfectly fine. That's also casting off. Okay, so we're going to do this across the entire round, across all these stitches. And this is what it means to bind off or cast off in pattern. You are just following the same stitch pattern that you were doing before the bind off. So here we go. Here's a knit stitch. So I'm going to bring my yarn up front and purl it. So if you're new to binding off, then you can check out this video here where I go over the bind off in great detail. All right, so let's bind off across the whole round. Here's my last stitch. There we go. And just slip that over. Perfect. Okay, so we've got 1 stitch left, and at this point I'm going to take out a pair of scissors, and I'm going to leave like 6 or 7 inches of yarn and then snip it right off. And then now I'm going to take my yarn tail and just wrap it around my needle from the front, just kind of like this. How do I say this? From the front to the back? Yeah, okay. Wrap it around, and then I'm going to take the stitch, the last stitch on my needle, and just drag it over that strand of yarn, and then draw the strand of yarn through that last stitch. And now I have secured my cast off. Beautiful. All right, so let's take a look and just admire our cast off edge. How gorgeous does this look? It's so beautiful. And now our cowl is off the needle. So I'm going to get out my tapestry needle, which just looks like a giant sewing needle, and I'm going to thread up these loose tail ends of yarn here. So we're just going to hide this tail end of yarn into the back of the cowl, thereby hiding it and securing it in place. So I'm just going to take my tapestry needle and go into the other side of the cowl, and I'll draw the yarn through, and I've just kind of closed that little gap there, right? And then from there, I'm going to go into the back side as well, maybe into the other side of the back, draw the yarn through, and I'm always looking at the front to see what the front looks like. And I think that looks great. It looks very nicely camouflaged. So now I'm going to turn into the back of the work. So you can see all these little bumps, right? These little purl bumps. So I'm just going to go down into the purl bump right here, and then maybe up into one. Another one, and then down into another, and maybe down once again into another purl bump, and then up into another one, and then down into the one beside it. And I've gone into like maybe 4 or 5 bumps already, and I think that's basically enough. I think 4 or 5, maybe 6 just for good measure. There we go. So I've woven in my tail end into these little seed stitch bumps. And I'll look on the other side, it looks pretty nice, right? So I'm going to take out my scissors, just snip it right off. So let's turn it over again. The bind off looks beautiful, perfect. Let's turn the cowl over. This is the cast on tail end. So we're going to do the exact same thing, thread it up onto the tapestry needle. So I'm going to go right into the inside of the cowl, and we're just going to go right into weaving in this tail end into some purl bumps. Snip off that tail end. All right, so now both of our yarn tails have been woven in. Our cowl is now complete. Go forth, wear it out into the world with pride.